Welcome back to another episode of True Crime Untold Cases. I'm your host, Harper Quinn. In the chaos of World War I, while soldiers fought in muddy trenches across Europe, a different kind of predator stalked the streets of Paris. Henri Landru, a seemingly unremarkable man with a distinctive beard, turned the wartime desperation of lonely widows into his hunting ground. Through carefully worded personal ads and calculated charm, he lured at least 10 women to his villa in Gambais, where they would vanish without a trace. Their assets emptied, their lives erased, and their remains reduced to ashes in his kitchen stove. Tonight, we'll unravel the chilling story of the man who would become known as the Bluebeard of Gambais, and how his meticulous business-like approach to murder almost let him get away with it all. Let's begin. In the fog-shrouded streets of wartime Paris, a sinister predator moved among the desperate and lonely, leaving a trail of vanished souls in his wake. The story I'm about to tell you takes place during one of humanity's darkest periods, when the world was consumed by the chaos of World War I. But while young men died in muddy trenches across Europe, another kind of killer was claiming victims on the home front. A murderer whose calculated brutality would earn him the chilling nickname, the Bluebeard of Gambais. Henri Landru appeared at first glance to be an unremarkable man. Born in Paris in 1869 to working-class parents, he stood just 5 feet 3 inches tall, with an unremarkable build and a distinctive beard that would later become infamous. But beneath his ordinary exterior lurked one of France's most methodical and ruthless serial killers. The war years had created perfect hunting grounds for someone like Landru. With so many men away fighting, countless women found themselves alone, many newly wealthy from inheritance or life insurance after losing husbands and sons to the conflict. These women yearned for companionship, security, and love, precisely what Landru promised in his carefully worded personal advertisements in Paris newspapers. One such advertisement read, "Widower with 2 children, aged 43, with comfortable income, serious and moving in good society, desires to meet widow with view to matrimony." The words were crafted to appeal to a specific type of woman, middle-aged, financially comfortable, and most importantly, alone. Landru was meticulous in his approach. He kept detailed notebooks documenting his victims and their assets, though he used code names and cryptic notations. When investigators later discovered these notebooks, they found lists of women's names, dates, and financial figures, all carefully organized. This wasn't the work of a frenzied killer, but rather a calculating predator who viewed murder as a business. His first known victim was Madame Jeanne-Marie Couchet, a 39-year-old widow with a teenage son. In 1915, Landru approached her under the alias Monsieur Diard, presenting himself as a successful businessman. He courted her carefully, gaining her trust over several months. Madame Couchet and her 17-year-old son André both disappeared in January 1915, after liquidating their assets at Landru's suggestion. What made Landru particularly effective was his ability to manipulate France's wartime bureaucracy. He knew that missing persons reports during this chaotic period were often given low priority. People disappeared frequently. Some fled the war, others moved to different cities seeking work, and many simply lost touch with family members amid the turmoil. The villa he rented in Gambais, about 35 miles outside Paris, became his killing ground. It was here that most of his victims met their end, though the exact method of their murders remained a mystery even after his capture. The villa's large kitchen stove would later become central to investigators' theories about how he disposed of the bodies. One of his most poignant victims was Madame Buisson, a 47-year-old widow who had already lost 2 sons to the war. When she met Landru, who was using the name Monsieur Fremier, she thought she'd found a second chance at happiness. Her letters to friends, discovered later, spoke of her joy at finding love again. She wrote, "At last, I have met a gentleman who understands me. We shall be married soon, and I will no longer be alone." Landru's method was always the same. He would convince his victims to sell their properties and holdings, transfer their wealth to his control, and then accompany him to his villa in Gambais. None of these women were ever seen alive again. Yet somehow he managed to maintain relationships with multiple victims simultaneously, keeping meticulous records of appointments and meetings in his notorious notebooks. The killer was careful to maintain appearances. He would return to Paris regularly, sending letters and postcards in his victims' names to their families and friends, explaining their prolonged absences. These letters, written in careful imitation of the victim's handwriting, would usually describe travel plans or sudden moves to other parts of France. As the list of missing women grew, Landru became increasingly bold. He began targeting women in rapid succession, sometimes juggling relationships with 3 or 4 potential victims at once. His notebooks showed that he approached his murders like a businessman managing multiple accounts, scheduling his meetings and murders with cold efficiency. The war provided perfect cover for his crimes. With communications disrupted, families scattered, and death a daily reality, the disappearance of middle-aged women didn't immediately raise alarms. When concerned relatives did file missing persons reports, they were often told that wartime conditions made thorough investigations impossible. But as 1917 turned to 1918, and more women vanished after meeting a mysterious gentleman with a beard, patterns began to emerge. Sister Marie Lacoste, whose friend Madame Célestine Buisson had disappeared after meeting Landru, began her own investigation. She would prove to be instrumental in bringing the killer to justice, though she had no idea at the time just how many victims she would help uncover. What made Landru's crimes particularly chilling was the methodical way he documented everything. In his notebooks, later seized by police, he recorded not just names and dates, but detailed financial information about each victim. He noted their assets, their debts, and even their daily habits. One entry simply read, "Madame Héon, 4,000 francs in government bonds, jewelry worth 8,000 francs. Below that, a single date marked her disappearance. As World War I drew to a close, Landru's carefully constructed world began to unravel. The return of peace meant more resources for police investigations, and families of missing women became more insistent about finding their loved ones. The web of disappearances, all connected to a mysterious bearded man, began to draw attention from authorities who had previously been too preoccupied with wartime duties to notice the pattern. The villa in Gambais, which had seen so many women enter but never leave, would eventually yield important clues. Neighbors reported strange smoke from the chimney, even in warm weather, and peculiar odors that they couldn't quite identify. These details would later become crucial evidence in understanding the fate of Landru's victims, though the full horror of what occurred in that quiet country house was still to be revealed. In this first part of our story, we've seen how Landru exploited the chaos of wartime France to create a perfect hunting ground for his crimes. But as we'll discover, even the most careful predator eventually leaves traces, and the web of evidence slowly closing around Henri Landru would soon bring his reign of terror to an end, revealing a tale of manipulation and murder that would shock not just France, but the entire world. The investigation into Landru's activities gained momentum when Sister Marie Lacoste's persistent inquiries about her friend Célestine Buisson caught the attention of Detective Inspector Jules Bellin. What initially seemed like a routine missing persons case soon revealed an intricate web of disappearances, all connected by similar circumstances and descriptions of a bearded suitor. The breakthrough came when investigators discovered that several missing women had sold their properties to different men. but when they compared the signatures on the documents, handwriting experts confirmed they were all written by the same person using various aliases. This discovery led them to multiple rented properties, including the now infamous villa in Gambais. When police finally arrested Landru on April 12, 1919, at his apartment in Paris, they found a remarkable cache of evidence. Among his possessions were 11 personal diaries filled with meticulous records, train tickets, and receipts. Most damning was a small notebook containing a list of 10 women's names and one boy, each followed by the simple notation disparu, disappeared. The search of his villa in Gambais yielded even more disturbing evidence. In the garden, investigators discovered bone fragments and ash containing human hair. The large cast-iron stove in the kitchen became the focus of intense scrutiny. Inside and around it, forensic experts found more bone fragments, buttons, and hairpins. A neighbor testified about regularly seeing thick, acrid smoke coming from the chimney, accompanied by a terrible stench, even during summer months. One of the most chilling discoveries was a receipt for 60 litres of gasoline delivered to the villa. When questioned about this unusual purchase for a property without a car, Landru claimed it was for a portable stove. However, investigators believed he used it to fuel the fires that destroyed his victims' remains. During his arrest, Landru maintained an eerily calm demeanor. When confronted with the evidence, he reportedly smiled and said, "Show me the bodies." This would become his primary defense throughout the investigation and trial. No bodies, no murder. He understood that without corpses, proving murder would be challenging, even with the circumstantial evidence mounting against him. The list of confirmed victims included Jeanne-Marie Couchet and her son André, Thérèse Labordeline, Marie-Angélique Guillain, Berthe Héon, Anna Collomb, André Bablet, Célestine Buisson, Louise Jaume, and Anne-Marie Pascal. Each woman had disappeared after meeting Landru, and each had transferred significant assets to him before vanishing. The trial began on November 7, 1921, at the Versailles Assize Court, becoming one of the most sensational criminal cases in French history. The courtroom was packed daily with spectators, including many of Paris's artistic and literary elite. Famous writers like Colette and Maurice Barré attended regularly, fascinated by the psychological complexity of the accused. During the trial, Landru's behavior was remarkably composed. He answered questions with precision and often displayed a sharp wit. When asked about the disappearance of Madame Couchet and her son, he replied with chilling detachment, "I fail to see how I can tell you where someone is when I don't know myself." His ability to maintain this calm facade, even when confronted with devastating evidence, unnerved many observers. The prosecution, led by Robert Godefroy, presented a methodical case. They showed how Landru had used at least 4 different aliases to conduct his schemes. They demonstrated his pattern of placing personal ads, courting vulnerable women, convincing them to sell their assets, and then making them disappear. The evidence included hundreds of letters, financial documents, and testimony from relatives of the victims. Perhaps most damaging was the testimony of Landru's neighbors in Gambais. Multiple witnesses described the suspicious smoke and horrific odors emanating from his property. One neighbor, Madame Roussin, testified about seeing Landru carrying heavy packages into the house late at night, followed by the sound of sawing and chopping, and then the inevitable thick smoke from the chimney the next day. The defense, led by Vincent de Mauro Giaffari, focused on the lack of bodies and attempted to paint Landru as a mere confidence man rather than a murderer. They suggested that the missing women might have left voluntarily, perhaps emigrating during the chaos of war. However, this argument struggled to explain why none of the women had contacted their families or accessed their bank accounts after disappearing. One of the most dramatic moments in the trial came when the prosecution presented Landru's notebooks. The meticulous entries showed not just names and dates, but detailed financial information about each victim. One entry read, December 1915, Madame Laborde-Line, 7,000 francs in bonds, jewelry, estimated value 12,000 francs. The date of her disappearance was marked with a simple X. Landru's final companion, Fernande Segre, provided crucial testimony. Though she had survived her relationship with him, she described his methodical nature and his frequent trips to Gambais. However, she maintained that she never suspected him of murder, describing him as always a perfect gentleman. Her testimony offered insights into how Landru could appear charming and trustworthy while concealing his true nature. The trial also revealed the calculating efficiency of Landru's methods. He would often maintain relationships with multiple women simultaneously, carefully scheduling his meetings to avoid any overlap. In his notebooks, he had even noted train schedules and created detailed itineraries to manage his various encounters. The prosecution presented evidence that Landru had purchased unusual amounts of fuel and cleaning supplies for the villa. Records showed he had bought large quantities of coal, wood, and oil, far more than necessary for normal household use. When questioned about these purchases, Landru claimed they were for heating and cooking, but could not explain why he needed such quantities in summer months. As the trial progressed, the image emerged of a man who approached murder with the precision of a businessman. Each victim was carefully selected, methodically stripped of assets, and then disposed of with frightening efficiency. The war had not only provided cover for his crimes, but had also created the perfect pool of vulnerable victims, women seeking companionship in a time of unprecedented social upheaval. The trial reached its climax when the prosecution presented their scientific evidence. Despite Landru's repeated challenges to show me the bodies, forensic experts had discovered something remarkable in the ashes from his villa's stove. Using newly developed techniques, they identified human bone fragments and traces of adipocere, a waxy substance formed by the decomposition of body fat. This physical evidence, though fragmentary, directly contradicted Landru's claims of innocence. The most damning testimony came from Professor Cohn Abrest, head of the Paris Toxicology Laboratory. He explained to the court how the high temperatures achieved in Landru's stove would have been sufficient to cremate human remains, leaving behind only the tiny fragments they had discovered. The professor's detailed scientific analysis helped the jury understand how Landru could have disposed of his victims without leaving intact bodies. Throughout the proceedings, Landru maintained his composure, often engaging in intellectual sparring with the prosecutors. When questioned about the smoke from his chimney, he famously replied, "I am not the keeper of my neighbor's eyes." His wit and seeming indifference to the charges against him both fascinated and repelled the public. On November 30th, 1921, after deliberating for 3 hours, the jury returned with their verdict. Henri Désiré Landru was found guilty of 11 murders and sentenced to death by guillotine. When the verdict was read, Landru remained characteristically stoic, showing no emotion. His only response was to turn to his defense lawyer and say, "Now I know what a nervous breakdown feels like." The condemned man spent his final months in Versailles prison, where he occupied himself by drawing sketches and writing letters. He maintained his innocence until the end, though he did make one cryptic statement to his lawyer. When asked if he had killed the women, he reportedly replied, "It is possible. In life, everything is possible." In the early hours of February 25th, 1922, Landru was awakened and informed that his time had come. He went through his final preparations with the same methodical attention to detail that had characterized his crimes. He asked for a final cigarette and 3 glasses of rum, which he consumed with apparent relish. As he was led to the guillotine outside the prison gates, Landru remained composed. His last words were directed to his lawyer. "In a moment, you will know my secret." But if there was a secret to be revealed, it died with him. At 6:05 a.m., the blade fell, and one of France's most notorious serial killers met his end. The aftermath of the Landru case had far-reaching implications for French law enforcement and society. His crimes highlighted the vulnerability of women in wartime and led to increased scrutiny of personal advertisements in newspapers. The case also advanced forensic science, as the techniques used to analyze the cremated remains were groundbreaking for their time. Landru's villa in Gambais became a macabre tourist attraction, with people traveling from across France to see the place where so many women met their end. The stove, which had played such a crucial role in the disposal of his victims, was preserved as evidence and later displayed in the Museum of Crime in Paris. The case continues to fascinate criminologists and historians, not just for its brutality, but for what it reveals about human nature and society. Landru's ability to exploit the chaos of wartime, his meticulous record-keeping, and his calm demeanor even in the face of death, paint a picture of a different kind of criminal, one who approached murder with the dedication of a businessman. The story of the Bluebeard of Gambais also serves as a dark reminder of how societal upheaval can create perfect conditions for predators. The disruption of normal social patterns during World War I, combined with the desperation for companionship and security, created vulnerabilities that Landru expertly exploited. Perhaps most chilling is the fact that Landru's true victim count may never be known. While he was convicted of 11 murders, his notebooks contained many more names, and some researchers believe he may have killed as many as 20 women during his reign of terror. The case of Henri Landru stands as one of the most significant criminal cases of the 20th century, not just in France but worldwide. It demonstrated the emergence of a new kind of serial killer, one who combined romantic manipulation with careful planning and business-like efficiency. His methods would later be studied by criminologists and law enforcement agencies, helping to develop profiles of similar predators. Today, more than a century after his crimes, the name Landru still evokes a particular kind of horror, the realization that sometimes the most dangerous monsters are those who appear most normal, those who maintain ledgers and keep receipts, those who approach murder not with passion, but with cold, calculating precision. The legacy of the Bluebeard of Gambais serves as a warning about the darkness that can lurk behind the most respectable facades, and how society's most vulnerable members can fall prey to those who know exactly how to exploit their loneliness and desperation. In the end, Henri Désiré Landru took most of his secrets to the grave, leaving behind only fragments of evidence and the haunting question of how many other victims might have fallen prey to his calculated charm.